Most people walk into no contact with a quiet expectation. This will make them feel the loss. This will finally break them. But that expectation is built on a misunderstanding of how the avoidant mind actually works. You're applying your emotional logic to someone whose entire system is designed to operate differently. For someone with an avoidant pattern, closeness doesn't automatically register as comfortat, often registers as pressure. Intimacy can feel like a slow erosion of autonomy, like something is being taken rather than shared. So when the relationship becomes intense, when emotions rise, when expectations deepen, their instinct is not to lean in, it's to create space. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling too much threatens their sense of control. Now think about what no contact looks like from that internal world. Silence, distance, no emotional demands, no expectations to meet, no need to explain themselves or navigate your feelings. From your side, it feels like withdrawal, like loss, like something is breaking apart. But from their side, at least initially, it can feel like relief. The pressure valve has been released. And this is where people get stuck, because they're watching for visible signs of pain, for some immediate reaction that validates their importance. When that doesn't happen, they assume it didn't work. Or worse, they assume they didn't matter. But neither of those conclusions is accurate. What's actually happening is much more subtle and much more psychological. Avoidants are not disconnected from emotion, they're defended against it. They've built an identity around self-reliance, around needing less, around staying in control of their internal world. So when no contact begins, it doesn't confront that identity, it protects it. It allows them to stay exactly who they believe they need to be. There's also something else at play here. Time. Avoidants process loss differently. Where someone else might feel the impact immediately, avoidants often experience a delayed response. Because when the noise disappears, when the emotional intensity fades, they can finally return to their baseline control, independence, distance. And for a while, that feels like stability. But here's the deeper truth. No contact on its own is passive. It removes you from their environment, but it doesn't challenge their internal narrative. It doesn't force them to question their patterns. It doesn't disrupt the belief that they are better off self-contained and unaffected. So if your strategy is built on the idea that absence alone will make them collapse, you're playing the wrong game. Absence creates space, but space is where avoidants are most comfortable. You're not stepping outside their comfort zone, you're stepping into it. This is why so many people stay stuck in cycles. They withdraw, wait, hope, and watch, while the avoidance simply adapts to the silence. And over time, that silence can even reinforce their belief that distance is the safest place to exist. Understanding this changes everything. Because now you stop using no contact as a tool to provoke a reaction, and you start seeing it for what it really is. A neutral state. It's not power. It's not transformation. It's just the absence of interaction. And if nothing else changes, if you don't change, then nothing meaningful is being challenged on their side either. No contact doesn't break an avoidant, because you can't disrupt someone by giving them exactly what they're wired to seek. If you really want to understand what moves an avoidant, you have to look beneath the behavior and into the structure of their identity. Because what you're dealing with isn't just distance or mixed signals or inconsistency, it's a carefully constructed sense of self. And at the center of that self is something very fragile that doesn't look fragile at all. The need to feel independent at all costs. An avoidance ego isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention in obvious ways. In fact, it often presents as the opposite calm, composed, self-contained. They'll tell you they don't need much, that they're fine on their own, that they prefer space. And over time, they come to believe that this isn't just a preference, it's who they are. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. That identity wasn't built in comfort. It was built in adaptation. At some point, needing others didn't feel safe, or didn't feel reliable, or didn't feel reciprocated. So the mind made a decision: if I don't depend on anyone, I can't be disappointed. If I stay in control, I can't be hurt. And what starts as a coping mechanism slowly becomes a philosophy of life. So when you step into that world with emotional openness, with vulnerability, with a desire for closeness, You're not just offering connection, you're unintentionally challenging that philosophy. You're asking them to move away from the very thing that makes them feel secure. This is why their reactions can feel so confusing. It's not that they don't feel something for you. It's that feeling something for you creates internal conflict. Because now there's a tension between two forces. The part of them that wants connection and the part of them that believes connection is dangerous. And when that tension rises, the ego steps in not as arrogance, but as protection. It reinforces the narrative. I'm better on my own. I don't need this. I don't need anyone. That belief becomes their anchor. It stabilizes them when emotions threaten to pull them somewhere unfamiliar. Now here's where it gets important. Because if their ego is built on independence, then anything that suggests they're not as independent as they thought becomes deeply unsettling. Not on the surface, they won't necessarily show it, but internally, it creates cracks in the identity. This is why chasing them doesn't work. When you pursue, when you overextend, when you try to prove your value, you're actually reinforcing their ego structure. You're confirming the dynamic where they remain self-sufficient and you become the one reaching. It keeps their identity intact. But when the dynamic shifts, when you stop needing, stop chasing, stop orienting your emotional world around them, that's when something subtle begins to happen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but psychologically. Because now the reflection they were relying on starts to disappear. They're no longer the one being pursued. They're no longer the center of someone else's emotional gravity. And without that, their sense of control isn't as solid as it once felt. The identity that said, I don't need anyone, starts to encounter a quiet contradiction. Then why does this feel different now that they're gone in a real way? And again, this isn't always conscious. Avoidants are incredibly skilled at maintaining their internal narrative. But the ego, no matter how refined, still depends on consistency. It needs the world around it to behave in ways that confirm what it believes. So when you change, genuinely change, you're not attacking their ego. You're removing the conditions that kept it stable. And that's a very different kind of impact. It's not loud. It's not reactive. But it's far more disruptive than anything you could say or do directly. Because at the end of the day, an avoidant's greatest strength, their independence, is also the very thing that becomes fragile when it's no longer mirrored back to them. So once you begin to understand the structure of their egoth's deep attachment to independence and control, the next question becomes obvious. What actually reaches them? What cuts through that carefully maintained distance? Because if chasing reinforces their defenses and silence alone allows them to stay comfortable, then what creates real impact? It comes down to something most people overlook entirely: predictability. Avoidants don't just seek space, they seek emotional predictability. They learn to read patterns quickly. If you've ever been close to one, you'll notice this over time. They know when you're about to reach out. They know when you're feeling anxious. They can sense when you're about to ask for more, need reassurance, or try to pull them closer. And once they recognize that pattern, they adjust by creating distance before the pressure fully arrives. In other words, it's not your emotions alone that push them away, it's the certainty of those emotions and what they will demand from them. When your behavior becomes predictable, it allows them to stay one step ahead. They don't have to confront anything deeply because they already know how the interaction will unfold. You reach, they retreat. You question, they deflect. You get closer, they create space. It becomes a loop, and in that loop, they remain in control. So if you're trying to create a shift, doing more of the same, even if it's more intense, more emotional, or more persistent, won't break the pattern. It will strengthen it. What actually unsettles an avoidant is when that predictability disappears. Not in a chaotic or reactive way, but in a grounded, self-contained way. When your responses no longer follow the script they've come to expect, something changes. When you don't chase after distance, when you don't react emotionally to silence, when you don't immediately lean in the moment they pull back now, they don't have a clear map of what's happening. And that lack of a map creates a subtle kind of tension, because now, for the first time, they're not managing the dynamic, they're experiencing it. They can't anticipate your next move, which means they can't fully protect themselves in advance. And that's unfamiliar territory. This is where people often make a critical mistake. They hear be unpredictable, and they interpret it as playing games being hot and cold, creating artificial distance, trying to provoke a reaction. But that kind of inconsistency is still reactive. It's still centered around them. And avoidance can feel that. It doesn't disrupt their system, it just confirms instability, which pushes them further into control. Real unpredictability doesn't come from strategy, it comes from self-possession. It comes from you being so internally grounded that your actions are no longer driven by their behavior. You're not reacting to their distance. You're not adjusting yourself to maintain connection. You're simply acting from a place of clarity and self-respect. Sometimes that means you engage. Sometimes it means you don't. But the key difference is this. Your behavior is no longer organized around keeping them close. And that's what shifts the dynamic. Because now, instead of them managing your reactions, they're faced with something they can't easily categorize. They start to feel the absence of the patterns they relied on. The emotional rhythm they were used to is gone. And in that space, something new begins to emerge, not necessarily immediate vulnerability, but awareness, a subtle recognition that the dynamic is no longer predictable, no longer controlled in the same way. That's where their defenses start to loosen, not because you force them to, but because the structure those defenses depended on is no longer there. And when someone can't predict you, they can't control the distance between you. And once that predictability begins to dissolve, something even more significant starts to take shape, something that shifts the entire balance of the connection. Because up until this point, whether you realized it or not, the dynamic has likely been organized around one central force, need. Not just your need for them, but the perception of it. The subtle signals that say, you matter more in my emotional world than I do in yours. Avoidants are highly attuned to that imbalance. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. And when they feel that you're more invested, more available, more willing to adjust yourself to maintain the connection, it reinforces their position. It allows them to stay in control without effort. They don't have to lean in because the connection is already being sustained from your side. This is why the real shift doesn't happen when you withdraw, it happens when you transform. When your sense of self is no longer organized around their presence or absence. When your emotional stability is no longer dependent on how they show up. Because at that point, something fundamental changes. You stop relating to them from a place of need, and you start relating from a place of choice. And that difference is not subtle. It's profound. When you no longer need someone to respond in a certain way for you to feel okay, your energy changes. Your communication changes. Even your silence changes. There's no longer an underlying tension. No quiet urgency trying to pull something out of them. You're not waiting in the same way. You're not watching as closely. You're not interpreting every action as a signal of where you stand. You become, in a very real sense, self-contained. Now here's where this becomes impactful for an avoidant, because their entire identity, as we said earlier, is built on the belief that they are the self-contained one. They are the independent one. They are the one who doesn't need. So when they encounter someone who embodies that same stability, but without the emotional shutdown, it creates a kind of dissonance. You're present, but not dependent. Open, but not attached. Engaged, but not invested in a way that costs you your center. And suddenly, the dynamic they were operating within no longer exists. They can't rely on your need to maintain proximity. They can't assume that distance will pull you closer. They can't predict that silence will create pursuit. All the subtle mechanisms that once gave them a sense of control start to lose their function. And with that, the power balance begins to shift. Not in a manipulative sense, not in a way where you're trying to gain the upper hand, but in a way where the connection becomes neutral again, where neither person is carrying more of the emotional weight than the other, where your presence is no longer guaranteed by effort, but defined by alignment. And that's where something unexpected can happen. Because when an avoidant senses that they are no longer the center of your emotional gravity, they may feel a sense of relief or a sense of freedom. When they realize that your life continues to expand without them at its core, it interrupts a very quiet assumption they were holding, that they had time, that they could come and go without consequence, that your availability would remain constant regardless of their behavior. That assumption starts to erode, and in its place comes a new awareness not always conscious but deeply felt. The awareness that connection is no longer something they can passively receive, that if they want access to you, it requires presence, not distance. It requires engagement, not avoidance. But none of that becomes possible if you're still operating from need, because need keeps you anchored to their behavior. It keeps you reacting, adjusting, waiting. Freedom, on the other hand, changes the entire equation. When you reach a point where you are genuinely okay with or without them, not as a defense, but as a grounded truth, you step out of the dynamic that kept them comfortable. You're no longer reinforcing their independence by sacrificing your own. And in that moment, something shifts that no amount of chasing or silence ever could. Because the greatest disruption to someone who prides themselves on not needing anyone is encountering someone who no longer needs them either. And this is where the distinction becomes critical, because up to now, we've been talking about distance, about silence, about stepping back. But distance alone is not what creates impact. Absence by itself is neutral. It removes you from the equation, but it doesn't necessarily change how you exist in their mind. Indifference, on the other hand, is something entirely different. Indifference is not about pretending you don't care. It's not coldness, and it's not suppression. It's the natural byproduct of emotional reorganization. When your focus shifts, your priorities realign. And the person who once occupied the center of your attention is no longer sitting there. And that's the moment that begins to register on a much deeper level for an avoidant. Because as long as you care in a way that's visible, even if you're not reaching out, there's still an energetic thread connecting you to them. There's still a sense, subtle but real, that they matter in your internal world. And for someone whose identity is tied to independence, that quiet relevance reinforces their position. It keeps them significant without requiring them to engage. But when indifference sets in, that thread weakens, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself, but gradually, consistently, your attention moves elsewhere. Your emotional investment redistributes. You stop checking, stop wondering, stop interpreting. And most importantly, you stop orienting your sense of self around whether or not they are present. That shift is not always visible from the outside, but it is felt, because human connection is not just built on interaction, it's built on perceived significance, on the sense that I exist in your world in a meaningful way. And when that sense begins to fade, it creates a kind of absence that is very different from physical distance. This is where the avoidant ego starts to encounter something it can't easily rationalize. They can explain your silence. They can justify your absence. They can tell themselves a story about why you're not there. But indifference is harder to explain because it doesn't come with a clear narrative. It doesn't chase. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't demand. It simply moves on. And in that movement, something subtle begins to surface. A question, often unspoken. Did I lose something real? Not because you disappeared, but because you stopped revolving. That's what disrupts the internal balance. Because if their identity has been built on not needing, on being the one who remains unaffected, then encountering someone who is genuinely detached, without bitterness or pursuit, creates a mirror they're not used to facing. You're no longer the one holding on. And without that contrast, their sense of self doesn't feel as solid. Again, this is not always conscious. Avoidants are skilled at maintaining emotional distance, even from their own realizations. But the ego still responds to shifts in relevance. It notices when its influence changes, when its position in someone else's life is no longer secure. And indifference communicates something very specific. You are no longer central here. That message doesn't need to be spoken. In fact, it's more powerful when it isn't, because it's not coming from reaction, it's coming from transformation. Now, it's important to understand what this is not. This is not about punishing them. It's not about trying to make them feel what you felt. Because the moment indifference becomes a strategy, it loses its authenticity and they can sense that. It becomes another form of engagement, another way of staying connected through reaction. Real indifference is quiet. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't look back to measure its effect. It simply reflects a new internal reality that your life has expanded beyond the need for their presence. And that's where the impact lies. Because for someone who has always relied on distance to maintain control, there is nothing more destabilizing than realizing that distance no longer keeps them relevant. Silence can be ignored. Absence can be explained. But indifference cannot be negotiated with. And when someone feels that they are no longer emotionally significant in a place they once occupied so easily, it doesn't just create distance, that creates doubt. And doubt is where the ego begins to fracture. And when that doubt begins to take hold, when the old patterns no longer produce the same outcomes, when distance no longer guarantees relevance, something deeper is set into motion. Because at this stage, we're no longer talking about behavior. We're talking about access. Up until now, you've been available to them in ways that required very little from them. Emotionally accessible, mentally engaged, energetically present, even in your silence, there was still a door open. And that door mattered more than you realized. Not because they were consciously thinking about it every day, but because it reinforced a quiet certainty. If I reach, they'll be there. That certainty is what allowed them to maintain distance without feeling the full weight of loss. But when you evolve beyond that, when you become someone who is no longer easily accessible in the ways they once relied on, that certainty disappears. And with it, the foundation of their control begins to shift. This is what it means to become unreachable, not physically unavailable, not playing games, but fundamentally changed in how and whether someone can access your inner world. You're no longer emotionally on standby. You're no longer mentally circling the connection. You're no longer organizing your energy around the possibility of their return. Your attention has moved. Your identity has expanded. Your life is no longer structured around what they might do next. And here's the key. This change is not performative. It's not something you show, it's something you become. Because anything that is done to create an effect can be undone the moment the effect doesn't appear. But real transformation is stable. It doesn't fluctuate based on their response. It doesn't adjust itself to pull them back in. It stands on its own. Now, from the outside, this might look like distance, but from their internal experience, it feels very different because they're no longer interacting with the version of you they understood. The patterns are gone. The emotional access points are gone. The subtle cues that once told them where they stood are no longer available. And that creates something they're not used to facing. Limitation, not your limitation, their own. They begin to sense that if they were to reach out, the response wouldn't be the same. That the connection, if it exists at all, would require a different level of presence, a different kind of engagement, something they can't navigate with the same strategies. And this is where the deeper confrontation happens. Because avoidants don't just avoid others, they avoid parts of themselves. The parts that feel uncertain, dependent, vulnerable. The parts that challenge their identity as someone who doesn't need, who doesn't rely, who doesn't lose control. But when they encounter someone they can no longer access in familiar ways, those avoided parts don't disappear, they get closer. They start to feel the edge of something they can't easily dismiss. Not necessarily longing in the way others experience it, but a disruption, a sense that something meaningful has shifted beyond their reach. And for someone who has built their entire identity around maintaining distance, that realization is deeply uncomfortable. Because now, the only way to reconnect if they choose to is not through control, but through change. And change requires facing exactly what they've spent so long avoiding. That's why becoming unreachable is not about punishment, it's about evolution. It's the natural outcome of no longer participating in a dynamic that required you to shrink, to wait, to remain available in ways that cost you your center. You're still open, but not to anything that pulls you out of alignment. You're still capable of connection, but not at the expense of your self-respect. And that's what makes this so powerful. Because when someone realizes they can no longer access you in the ways they once could, it forces a question they can't answer with distance alone. What would it take to meet them where they are now? And that question doesn't challenge your value, it reveals theirs. At the end of the day, you don't disrupt an avoidant by chasing them or by disappearing. You disrupt them by becoming someone they can no longer reach without becoming someone different themselves. And when you step back and look at all of this together, a very different picture begins to emerge, one that most people never fully see when they're caught inside the experience. This was never about breaking someone. It was never about making them feel what you felt or forcing them to wake up or finally proving your value through their reaction. Because the moment your focus becomes changing them, you lose sight of the only thing you actually have control over, yourself. What you've really been doing, Jiff, you've followed this journey all the way through something far more powerful. You've been shifting out of a dynamic that kept you small, reactive, and dependent on someone else's emotional availability, and stepping into a version of yourself that is grounded, self-directed, and whole. And ironically, that is the only place from which any real impact can happen. Because avoidants don't respond to pressure. They don't respond to pursuit. And they don't respond to absence in the way most people expect. What they respond to, whether they consciously realize it or not, is a shift in reality. A shift in who you are, how you show up, and what you are no longer willing to participate in. When you stop needing, you stop chasing. When you stop chasing, you become unpredictable. When you become unpredictable, the dynamic loses its structure. And when the structure collapses, they are left not with your presence, but with themselves. That's the point where something real can happen. Not guaranteed, not immediate, but real. Because now, if they feel anything, if they move toward anything, it's not because you pulled them there. It's because something inside them was activated without your interference. But here's the truth. Most people don't want to hear. By the time you reach this level